Jesus says, don't lock your doors. I'm Justin Lasser, and this is We Know Not What We Do. This is the first episode in a series on the parables of the historical Jesus. We're going to put each parable together, each story together, and make a collage out of them, a mosaic, and what we see might be a world that Jesus would recognize. We're going to use the stories that he told, not the stories that people told about him. Each parable has a surprise in Jesus' own day. They challenge the system and the traditions that were being imposed on Roman and Jewish Galilee at the time. The Roman system of patron and client relations we will learn about. Honor and shame. Jesus will critique those. And not in this episode, but in the future, purity and impurity. These kind of three great pillars of Roman conventional society. We are not reconstructing the historical Jesus because we can't find that. What we can do is construct a plausible scenario that those who are in religious studies, in historical scholarship, might accept as plausible based on the rules that we agree to play by. Again, each parable has a surprise. We're going to look at two today, and we're going to go to 1st century Galilee around the year 20 CE. The Sea of Galilee is not necessarily a sea, but a large lake. Everything in the biblical world is blown up, so lakes become seas, and this very dry place called the Dead Sea might be better called the Salt Sea or the the Dead Lake. When I think back in college, I don't remember the books I read. I don't memorize lengthy speeches, but I do remember jokes, and I'm not that good at it, unlike most of my students, but I remember some lyrics. You see, a joke is memorable. The parables aren't necessarily jokes, but there are some comedic things that happen in there because, like a great comedian, they're not expected. And we're going to find a little element of that in each of the parables that we pursue in this series. We have to first turn back the clock to understand the village code just prior to the foundation of an incredible city called Tiberias on the southern rim of the sea or lake of Galilee. It's a beautiful place, fresh water, abundance of fish, and the home base traditionally is a town, not necessarily a city, called Capernaum, Capharnaum. This is the home of the Jesus movement according to the Gospel of Mark. It also appears in our earliest gospel that scholars call Q. We're going to learn more about this in the future, but this is a source that Matthew and Luke both use, and Mark might have been aware of. There are terse sayings, short aphorisms, such as, love your enemies, give to those that can't pay you back. These sayings that might have been spoken by the historical Jesus and elaborated by his scribal admirers and tradents, those insights often match up with the parables that we have in our Gospels. You might be thinking, well, why don't we just read the Gospels and read the parables there? Because each Gospel writer uses parables in a different way. Mark, for example, imagines them as cryptic, enigmatic, mysterious stories intended to make you confused, and you've got to work your ass off to understand what's going on in them. For Luke, they're rather banal, simple example stories. For Matthew, they're often end-of-the-world eschatological judgment scenes with the sheep and the goats on different sides, or people going to a wedding and then they get kicked out because they're not wearing the right outfit. So the parable of the feast, for example, Matthew will have a different ending where a king comes in and he kicks out people that weren't wearing the right outfit, whereas in Luke and Thomas that have the same story, This is not a wedding feast, but a feast where people are invited and the lame, the blind, and all of those are fed. So we have different applications of these stories depending on which context we're in. We're going to look at two parables today: the parable of the friend at midnight, and sometimes referred to as the parable of the rich fool. But before we do that, we have to continue our quest into the Roman Galilee. We're not going to Jerusalem today or any major cities. We are in a rural gospel world. Capernaum is likely the home base. And if you look at it, it is small, roughly 1,000 people. The houses are really close together. And in that bottom image on the right, that is Peter's house traditionally. You'll have to forgive the Roman Catholic Church of the 1960s and so on. The last century was not the best for Catholic architecture. They really like these kind of spaceship, dreary style cement buildings. But through that glass, you can see the very room where the Jesus tradition may have begun. You will see an image of Petros, the house of Peter. And before we continue, just imagine what it would be like to sit there and listen to Jesus share these stories. These stories are very serious, but my God, they are also quite funny. And, I don't know about you, I've had that terrible experience where I take a date to a comedy show and I'm sitting near the front. Don't ever do that. And I realize I'm laughing along, and then all of a sudden I realize I think they're making fun of me. And there are different veiled critiques of the wealthy in these parables, and they're really quite enjoyable, and we're going to look at that today. Giving and receiving in the ancient Mediterranean. Prior to the 20s of the Common Era, otherwise known as AD, the year of our Lord, you have what is often referred to as the village code, a series of unwritten rules of the ways that people associate with each other. This is a rural economy. Things are not easy. The soil is not easy to cultivate for peasants. They usually have plots of land that are not enviable. They're rocky, stony, and so forth. There are large villas that are being built. So prior to the 20s of the Common Era, before the foundation of this great city, Tiberias, money was around, but not nearly as much as it will be after the foundation of this city around 2021 CE. Prior to that, in the village code, you would have a shared oven where people would bake bread together. Various families, primarily women, sometimes children, would take the responsibility for a village of, say, 200 people like Nazareth, or a Chorazin, something like 300 to 600 people. And various women would have a particular day or part of the week where they would make the bread. The wine presses were held in common. Olive presses were held in common. This was a community that had to band together. There were also scribal groups, scribal tradents, that would do basic legal documents. And this allows us to read these parables in the trash. What I'm telling you comes from Ernest van Eyck's incredible study on the parables. It's called The Parables of Jesus the Galilean, Stories of a Social Prophet. What he did, along with other scholars and his mentor, John Kloppenborg, probably the greatest scholar of the New Testament in the last century, they went and discovered or translated and worked with others who have translated basically documents from a trash dump in Upper Egypt, places like Oxyrhynchus, and these fragmentary documents that are utterly mundane, thoroughly boring, tax receipts, marriage contracts, tenant contracts, day laborers, complaints against people leaving their animals to kind of eat the stuff that's in your yard. They're really mundane parts of life in the ancient world, but they show us a lot about the context in which these parables were first told. Almost every character in the parables of Jesus finds a way to be in these documents that are mundane, tax, contracts, and so on. And so from them, we learn more about what the context might have been at the earliest part of the Jesus movement, as opposed to its later flowering in the gospel tradition, in its beautiful elaborations, poetic elaborations by Mark, by Matthew, by Luke, by Thomas, by John, by Mary, by Philip, and so on. So we have many different sources here. So the village code, it's a barter system, but not only a barter system. Herod the Great, and by the way, before going any further there, anyone with the term great attached to their name is someone you probably don't want to be friends with in the modern world. To be great did not mean to be good, but to be pretty damn significant. Herod the Great, Herod, built a city called Caesarea, absolutely beautiful Caesarea Maritima, right on the Mediterranean, and it's, I believe, the first city to use underwater cement, concrete. And he named it after his patron, Augustus Caesar, hence Caesarea. One of his sons, who contested, was a pretender to his throne after the death of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, was awarded certain parts of Israel, Palestine in that time in terms of the Roman province, and he wanted to follow the suit of his father. He decided to build a city for his, keyword for this one, patron, the Emperor Tiberius. And so what did he name it? Tiberias. Beautiful city, beautiful location. You can see it in the distance when you're sitting in Capernaum and you put your feet in the water of the Sea of Galilee after you try to walk on it, and you can see this beautiful shining pearl in the distance. As beautiful as it is, a city is not welcome for a peasant that lives in its orbit. Things are going to be changing now. And one of the first things that Herod Antipas does in order to exploit this region and bring its vast resources to the market of the Roman world is to mint coin. So he has a coin mint, and now when you have coin, when you have money that is currency, you can now hold people in debt. And that is one of the greatest things that the historical Jesus, the earliest Jesus tradition, is going to be opposed to. Mind you, in the Orthodox Christian tradition as it emerges, equally opposed to selling money at interest. So money becomes a serious issue. It's a form of exploitation. And what we don't want to know is that Jesus thinks money is silly. There was a man that came to Jesus trying to catch him and said, Jesus, Caesar's men say that we should pay taxes. Should we do that? Then what does Jesus say? Depending on which source. Give me that coin. Let me see it. Oh, well, that's Caesar's face on it. Well, it must be his. Give it to him. Money is not a precious resource for Jesus. What you might not want to know is that inflation and all that stuff is not part of the Christian tradition. After Herod Antipas mints coins, things are going to change in the countryside. In a place like Capernaum of roughly 1,000 people, or a Magdala with 500 or so people, or Nazareth, something like 200 people, now they're using money. And now they can take out loans. But as in the contemporary world, a payday loan place is an absolute atrocity. It is an immoral failing in every possible way. These loans are designed, as they are today, as they are in the ancient world, to get people off their land, to get them to lose their homes so that these people can buy it. And in the first century, as John Kloppenborg's incredible book on the tenants in the vineyard explains, we have a concerted attempt and program by people who are the elites of society to go in and buy up the land of the peasants. So now the peasants are left with small plots that are stony, rocky, full of thorns, and birds ravage them. The village code is something that the historical Jesus is seeking to not only restore, but to reinvent. And this is something called the kingdom of God. Why are the poor blessed? I always thought that was so strange. I've never knocked on the door of a poor person and say, "Hey, are you happy? You're so blessed." Or the hungry, "Hey, you're happy? You're not eating." They're blessed because for those who join this kingdom of God movement, they will be fed, because those who have food will give. They will go hungry in order that the others may be fed. If we look at the Gospel of Thomas, it's a difficult Coptic phrase, but it's pretty clear that it means, blessed are those who go hungry so that others may eat. Before we go to our two parables, giving and receiving in the ancient world, we have three forms of giving and receiving. The first one is called negative reciprocity. This is the one that you don't want. It's basically the person that's offering you something purely out of self-interest. They're hoping to exploit you, to use you as a client, to make a client out of you. A patron is going to be lauded in the streets, praised in the streets by him generally, sometimes her, but him for giving you a debt. And then that means that you have to pay back in terms of praise and honor, making sure that people aren't speaking against your patron. So there's different relations. Indeed, honor was a more important currency than money in the first century. So examples of this could be predatory loans designed to procure peasant lands, slavery, indentured servitude, and the most obscene part of this is that once these elites in the cities would offer interest loans, the person would fail to pay them, they would default, and then that wealthy elite person in the city, an absentee landlord, would buy that plot of land. And now you might work on the land that you used to own as a tenant or a day laborer. This was quite common. We see it throughout the literature and the documents that were recovered from these trash dumps in Egypt in the 1st or 3rd century BCE up until almost the 7th century of the Common Era. The second form is called balanced reciprocity, a mutual exchange of goods, favors, or prestige that benefited both parties. This is something we don't want to know. We think this is fair. I give something to you, you give something to me, vice versa. Everything is hunky-dory, we're good. This is characterized by the patron-client relations that delineated fixed economic and social relations between people of unequal rank. Finally, the form of the village code, the form that Jesus would want to re-envision, reimagine, it is the great Israelite, Hebrew, Jewish prophetic tradition of Amos, of Hosea, of Micah, and so on, that in order to be a child of God, one must give in the way that God gives. That is, to reign on the good and the bad, the wicked and the just equally. Everyone is cared for in this early vision. We can see that in a speech in the Q Gospel about looking at the lilies of the field and how they're cared for without God doing anything for them. We can see this in one of the earliest speeches in that Q Gospel, where Jesus encourages those who listen to look at the lilies of the field, the birds of the air, and how they are cared for without working. Generalized reciprocity is this altruistic, great giving that expects nothing in return. This is the kind of love that you would hope a lover, a family member would have for you. You don't want them to give you something and expect it back, which is, as I've said before, grace for the Romans came with obligations. The grace that Paul talks about is a gift that is given without anything expected in return. The same thing in the Jesus tradition in Q and others, you must give to those that can't pay you back. That is called a grace, and you're not allowed to ask for it back. Our first parable is the friend at midnight. I'm going to read a version from the New Revised Standard Version. This is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verses 5 through 8. And he said to them, "Suppose one of you has a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived, and I have nothing to set before him.' And he answered from within, 'Do not bother me. The door has already been locked, and my children are in bed with me. I cannot get up and give you anything. I tell you, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs." That verse 8 is quite mysterious. That persistence in Greek is anadion, sometimes pronounced anadeion, but anadeion, it can have a variety of uses and applications, and persistence is probably not the right one. But if we read it this way, Luke uses this story as an example of appealing to God in prayer. But in terms of the Greek, in terms of the first century context, it can mean something else, because we can tell that Luke is adding and elaborating to it. He is using it, and that's great because he is doing poetry, not just remembering something as if you would catch it on a camcorder. I'm going to read a slightly different translation that I've put together for that word, anadion. We will not read the whole thing again, just the verse 8. But before doing that, I would like you to look at this image of Capernaum that has been reconstructed, and look how close those homes are with each other. These homes, you would hear someone knocking in the other room or across one of the alleys here, and that is pretty significant for the first century. You see, for us today, if someone knocked on my door at the middle of the night and said, "Hey, I don't have any bread to give my friend," I might be inclined, forgive me, to say, "I'm sorry, I don't have any," even if I did. And actually I don't, because I'm trying to only have healthy stuff in my fridge. And white bread, as great as it is not something I'm going to do today. In any case, I would say, "No, sorry, I drive past the person that's holding up a cardboard sign that's asking for food, and I make excuses that are inexplicable and unjustifiable. I claim to be opposed to hunger, and yet I find reasons to walk past those people." And this parable is an indictment of me as well. In any case, in the Roman world, in the Jewish Roman world, I should be specific here, in the Middle East today, it's just as common. How you treat the stranger, how you treat the alien, is how God will treat you. How you treat the stranger is more important in a bizarre and strange way, a counterintuitive way, than how you treat even your own family. We have this in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Prior to that, 2 chapters before, Abraham is visited by 3 mysterious figures, and he is hospitable to them. One of them, he learns, is God. 2 of these other messengers of God go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot, who is related to Abraham, takes them in, and he provides them hospitality, the most important virtue in the Middle Eastern context. The men of that city want to get to know them, that is, sexually. And what does he say, Lot? "Take my daughters, for they have known no man, and that means that they're virgin, but don't touch these people that came under my roof. This is not an issue of homosexuality or heterosexuality and things like that, as it unfortunately has been contrived to be, but it's an issue of hospitality. And it shows us that for Lot, how you treat the stranger, how you treat the alien is more important than anything else. And the whole city is dishonored by this act. Later, his daughters will get the best of him and get him drunk, and they will have sex with him, and they will have two nations. It's a great way of saying the neighbors of Israel are related to us, but they're incestuous. Anyway, that's a different story. But the point being that hospitality is the chief virtue. So this man who is in his house, who has locked his doors, is saying that I don't have to get up and give you any. But the whole town, the whole village now is implicated in this. It'll be a dishonorable village if they don't care for the stranger, the alien among them. Is this not something that Christians do not want to know in the United States of America? Indeed, most Christians in America feel that they're Christian before they're American, which is why, in my experience, whenever we bring this stuff up in class, people go crazy. They get really upset because they don't want to make a decision between the flag and the person that the Gospels obligate them to care for, because Christ is revealed in, God is revealed in the stranger, or as Fox News would have it, the illegal alien. Back to our parable, let's look at this other verse. In terms of my translation, the person that is persistent, we're going to change that word, same word, but we're going to translate it differently, is not the person that's outside knocking on the door. Wake up, come on, I have this friend. Let's read it slightly different. But I say to you, Jesus saying, even if he will not get up and give it to him because he is his friend, he will still get up and give it to him, that is, the person knocking, whatever he needs because of his, inside the house, because of the person in the house, his insensitive self-interest. Ana Dion. In order, the implied part here is to make him his client. He locked his doors because he's expecting the guy that's knocking on the door to do something for him. He is trying to make him owe him something. The Jesus tradition is opposed fundamentally to the idea that people owe you something. If you feel that anyone owes you something, you are opposed to this early parabolic and early speech tradition in the earliest gospel in Q, and against the Pauline tradition in the epistles, the letters of Paul. No one owes you anything, but you are, this is not the best deal here, I guess, equally and more so obligated to everyone else. No one can call the favor, but you are always indebted to others. The obligation is for you to care for others. So if the stranger is in your town, the illegal alien is crossing the border, or whatever it would be, it is incumbent upon you to take that as the chief virtue and to care for them. So what's happening here? He's banging on the door. This guy doesn't want to get up. They're playing chicken. Who's going to blink first? The guy keeps on pounding. But look at it. These houses are so close together. The other neighbors might hear. And that's why, out of his self-interest, this selfish interest, he gets up and gives him the bread so that the other folks will not realize that he is trying to pretend that the bread is his own. Personal property is defended in the Jesus tradition. Private property, in terms of the means of production in contemporary Marxist and capitalist speech, that is not yours. The bread was baked in common in these villages and larger towns. And so for him to say, I won't give it to you, that was a way of him saying, I want you to owe me something. And the Jesus tradition is against that. So where does Jesus stand in this parable? The guy that's knocking on the door. Not because he is persistent, but because the person in the house, out of his own selfish interest, is going to get up so that other people don't hear him denying this person food. The Christian tradition is absolutely clear and universal here, at least until the 16th century, that if a person is hungry and they take bread, they did not steal. People don't want to know this. They don't steal. The person who's stealing is the one who has bread and then doesn't provide it. Think of the analogs today with people that are extremely, excessively, grotesquely wealthy, and they live in a world where people are hungry and dying. Second parable we'll deal with is from Luke chapter 11, verses 5 through 8. It's also found in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 63. I'm going to read from Bentley Hart's translation of the Gospel of Luke. And he told him a parable, saying, The land of a rich man yielded well. And he reasoned with himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to gather in my fruits. And he said, I know what I'll do. I'll pull down my granaries, my barns, and build larger ones. And I shall gather there all my grain and all my goods, and I will say, Soul, soul, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, make merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night they demand your soul from you. The things you prepare, whose will they be? Hint, hint, the poor. Luke offers a summary statement that is not in the Gospel of Thomas, which probably means that it's Luke here writing. Thus is the one storing up treasure for himself and not being rich toward God. Well, what did this person do wrong? Again, something we would prefer not to know. This guy is acting the way that any good capitalist would. The land is cultivated, it's producing much fruit, and what does he say? I'm going to hold it to myself. I'm going to build bigger barns, tear down those, build bigger barns, and take care of myself. Taking care of yourself, looking after your own interest, precisely what Paul says not to do in Philippians chapter 2. Looking after your own interest and for yourself is not a virtue in the Jesus tradition. This guy is not doing the right thing. He is misinterpreting a miracle. He is misinterpreting the pure fortuitousness of growth, of land that produces of its own the seeds and the plants for human life. He loses it that night. Those who try to save their soul will lose their soul in the Jesus tradition. Those who try to preserve their property will lose their property. Those who are first will be the last. Those who are last will be the first. Give to anyone that begs. Do not expect anything in return. How you judge others, that is how you will be judged. And in this case, I cannot help but be reminded of Hurricane Katrina. In the wake of that cataclysmic event, when people were suffering and dying and trying to get out of the city, there were owners of gas stations that were price gouging. They were, in their own way, pulling down their barns and building bigger ones. They were trying to jack the price up as people left because there was a limited amount of fuel. When we look at the great church fathers and mothers of the Cappadocian world, that is contemporary Turkey, 4th century, 5th century, we have sermons that relate to this very parable. And so we know I'm not just off my rocker, nor were the traditions that were recovered in these trash dumps and these caches of documents in Egypt in these dry climates. I'm not off my rocker. They are going to make the same claims that I am now, that the property here is not their own. The wealthy are there to serve the poor, which is why, by the way, if you go to an Orthodox monastery and many Catholic ones, the first thing they do is to pray for the blessed founders of the church or the monastery so that those who are poor would pray for the wealthy, and that's the only way that they would get in. You can read Clement of Alexandria, probably the earliest attempt at not accepting or trying to reimagine what is articulated so clearly here. And the title of that is On Whether the Rich Man Can Be Saved. And again, the only reason he has to write that is because the implication of the Gospels is that they can't, even though you might think that you can fit through the eye of a needle as a camel. Good luck. So what should we learn from these two parables? In the patron-client system, in each case, there is someone that is trying to make a client out of someone else. They're trying to get someone to owe them something else. In one case, we have the person in the friend at midnight in the house. He wants to make a client of the one who's knocking. And then in the parable of the rich fool, he is trying to use his command of these resources to make them, to increase the demand for them by removing the supply and waiting for the price to go up. So when people are at their greatest needs, they will have to do that. They will have to pay a higher price. St. John Chrysostom, the Golden Mouth, one of the great church fathers who offers much of the Byzantine Christian Orthodox world its liturgy, its song in church, writes this about the second parable, the parable of the rich fool. I will not read all of it, just the bold part. Now someone who takes a man who is clothed and renders him naked would be termed a robber. But when someone fails to clothe the naked, while he is able to do this, is such a man deserving of any other appellation? The bread which you hold back belongs to the hungry. The coat which you guard in your locked storage chests belong to the naked. The footwear moldering in your closet belongs to those without shoes. The silver that you keep hidden in a safe place belongs to the one in need. Thus, however, many are those whom you could have provided for. So many are those whom you have wronged. I'm not out on a limb here. This is part of the Jesus tradition. Or as he famously said, if you do not find Christ in the beggar at the church door, neither will you find him in the chalice, where one tastes of Jesus in the classic Christian traditions. So what don't we want to know here? That Jesus stands against the wealthy man and against those who lock their doors in the village, against those who think their wealth is their own. These are uncomfortable things to learn, but these interpretations of the parables do align with our earliest speeches attributed to Jesus. And we can imagine in our mind Jesus sitting and sharing this story. It would be uncomfortable. He is invited by a wealthy person to their home, and they say, hey, I hear you're talking about this kingdom of God. What is it like? And he tells a story about the host who might end up dead. This night your soul is required of you. Jesus has taken the honor and shame in the patron and client system and turned it on its head. He is recovering, restoring, revitalizing, and reimagining the village code. He stands in the great lineage of Amos and Micah, Hosea, Isaiah, and others. Thank you.